Hello, I'm Mike Keating, and on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to run through a few housekeeping points, if I may. Number one, you should all be muted and cameras turned off. Number two, this webinar is accredited for CPD points if relevant to your ongoing professional development program. Three, the video will be available on our website, hosted by YouTube, and following the event, we will email you for your valuable feedback. And finally, if you'd like to ask a question, please do by going to the chat button at the bottom of your screen. This will be answered at the end of the session by way of a Q&A. And given the relevance of this presentation, I would hope that we get plenty of engagement and questions. Okay, so today's webinar, Practical Insights on Financial Resilience and Orderly Wind Down Planning, is brought to you by Grant Thornton, a valued supplier member of the MGAA. It is my pleasure, therefore, to introduce you to Bradley Chadwick, who will lead us through his presentation. Over to you, Bradley.
Great, thanks, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm looking forward to spending the next 45 minutes or so with you. If all goes well, I should finish my prepared remarks with plenty of time for questions. So let's hope everything goes well. The subject for today is practical insights on financial resilience and orderly wind down. There are some housekeeping points. Again, just to reiterate, you're muted. If you've got a question, use the chat function at the bottom. And those are my housekeeping points. Some observations about your speaker today. I lead the Grant Thornton LLMI wind down planning engagements. Some of my relevant experience, I have been leading wind down and contingency planning for UK regulated entities, intermediaries. I've advised both capacity providers and lenders to distressed intermediaries on how to mitigate the risk to themselves and also to minimize the losses. And I have sat in management's shoes as CFO and COO of regulated MGAs, brokers, insurtechs, and a premium finance business, which creates a unique perspective. So the agenda today. The impetus for this coming wind down planning, which is not new, it's been around for some period of time. The impetus for it being back on the radar was a Dear CEO letter on November the 3rd. So I thought we could spend a little bit of time going through some of the key parts of the CEO letter, which is really the FCA's supervision strategy through the period November 2021. And then I thought we could spend a little bit of time discussing why the FCA might be prioritizing it now, because when things are in context, it is easier to react to it. Following that, it is incumbent upon me to take you through the FCA's guidance. There are over 60 pages of guidance, so apologies in advance, it will be a whistle-stop tour. And then having gone through the guidance, just to talk through some of my real-life practical insights and experiences and judgments, really, that you will have to make as people doing the wind-down planning. So that, and then hopefully some questions at the end. So that's the agenda as it stands. Okay, so the Dear CEO letter. So if I could just go back a slide quickly. The learning objectives for today are covered by the slide. So these are the same learning objectives for CPE. And so if I can demonstrate that you've learned that, this should be qualify for continued professional development. So the Dear CEO letter, I'm going to hold up a copy now, just so you can see. So it's 7 pages, and there are a couple of key clauses that I would like to spend some time focusing on. The first is that the FCA's overarching aim in supervising entity is to ensure there is a market that works well for all participants. So they are focused on the market and market integrity. Then the FCA in their letter advised that they're expecting firms' models to remain financially resilient during this period of time, ... So what they're saying is they understand that COVID has impacted models, but they're expecting you to maintain financial resilience. However, that being said, they've already sent out one survey to the market, and they'll be sending out another survey. And those surveys have identified that the number one risk of harm to the market is financial resilience and orderly wind down. So they've listed 4 risks, but the first one they list is financial resilience and orderly wind down. In their letter, they reiterate 3 points that they made in a letter of 17th April 2020. And I find when the FCA repeats things, it's worth pausing to reflect on them. So just to go through the 3 things that they've reiterated. The first is that they expect firms to plan ahead and to manage your financial resources in such a way that you've taken appropriate steps to have a wind down plan in place and be in a strong position. So that's the first point. The second thing is that if in preparing a wind down plan, it is appropriate to consider how you may exit the market in an orderly way, focusing on how to reduce the harm to policyholders and the market. And then they reiterate that if you're concerned, you should talk to them early. And actually from experience, I think that is something, it is worth remembering that the FCA see a lot of these kinds of situations and are experienced, and so they can actually add value to you in your processes. So that would be the key messages. Some other items that are worth just pulling out for the constituents of this call is the FCA says they will contact firms and they will expect them to be able to explain what they've done in response to this letter. And they will be looking to make sure that the arrangements are in place for the orderly continued provision of services to firms' customer. So really what they're trying to say is make sure you've got a way to ensure there's no policyholder detriment. And then I've left this other second bullet point in here for a reason, because the FCA, they don't explicitly give any guidance, but it's interesting to see what they refer to. They say people might be transferring customers to other regulated entities. You might be transferring your customers to the underlying insurer itself, or you might be able to handle ongoing routine servicing. So it's interesting that they have already jumped to 3 of the possible solutions that people might contemplate when coming up with scenarios for wind down planning. So I thought that was interesting enough that I would leave it in for the slide. So why is the FCA focused on wind down planning? So, and why now? So there has been significant reporting in the press, and there was a Clyde & Co survey and an Insurance Times survey, all of which, and it's hard to summarize all of them into 3 bullet points, but there's a hardening market, the disruption to specific parts of the market around business interruption, specific products, means that the carriers are reported to be looking at their distribution chains and are reported to be considering changing their distribution chains and restricting capacity in some cases to focus on their better quality distributors. And similarly, the intermediaries surveyed are expecting that some of the capacity providers will withdraw capacity. So there is evidence of disruption, which makes the FCA concerned enough that they are focusing on this again. I have written 3 articles on the subject, and we've put links to them below. And so if you're looking for more insights of what people think's coming, we've captured that below. The other reason I think the FCA has made it a #1 priority is the overlap between wind down planning and its other regulatory priorities. So it's focused on operational resilience, which many of you are working on and have been working on for some period of time. And it's focused on the senior manager certification regime, said differently, governance responsibility. Both of these, as you will see when we go through the presentation, are key parts of wind down planning. So to the extent operational resilience work is done and the senior manager certification regime has been enacted on, the firms will have some of the foundational building blocks necessary to prepare the wind down plans. Interestingly, the FCA reminds firms that they're required to have appropriate professional indemnity insurance. So I just thought it was interesting that that came out in their letter as well. And it speaks to some of the challenges in the market and some of the pricing issues going on in the market. So the next section of the presentation is a whistle-stop tour through the 70-page or 60-page FCA wind-down planning guide. I do need to apologize. I prepared my presentation based on the October 2020 guidance, which I had printed off on my desk and is well marked and well read. And I noticed yesterday that there's an updated December 2020 version. I did go through it and I haven't noticed significant differences in the areas that I'm focused on, but I do ask your for your patience if there is anything, and I welcome feedback if I've missed anything. So just full disclosure. So FCA guidance. Okay, so I like to start with the objectives of the FCA, and I know I'm repeating myself, but I think it comes to the tone of what they're trying to achieve. So the FCA is trying to ensure that there's a wholesale market that works well for its participants and customers. So if that's what its objective is, it then goes on to say that an effective wind down plan enables a firm to cease its regulated activities and achieve cancellation of permissions with minimal adverse impact on its clients, counterparties, and the wider market. So it's looking at three constituent groups, both your clients, so either the brokers or the policyholders, depending on whether you're doing direct or indirect business, your counterparties, and the wider market. And the FCA specifically goes on to say that this should be considered for both a strategic exit and an unexpected crisis or insolvency. So the FCA specifically calls out the difference between the two, and I will spend a little bit of time on that later on in the presentation. Then the FCA goes on to say that a wind down plan can also help a firm to assess if it would have adequate resources to wind down in an orderly manner. So the key word there is the orderly manner, and the second one's the adequate resources. And I'm sure there will be questions, but we will try and spend some time thinking through what adequate resources mean when we get to some later slides. So I have resisted the urge to put significant wording verbatim onto the slide. So I will just take you through a couple of the key paragraphs in the guidance, and because I think when you're preparing your own wind down plans, it'll be helpful for you to know what we think the salient points are and where we're getting it. And also the FCA have put together a very robust document. So to a certain extent, I don't need to recreate the wheel. I am, however, going to take a point of liberty. When you get to 3.1 in the FCA's guidance, they talk about what is wind down planning, and then they talk about a process. And I have leapfrogged and put governance as the first bullet point, even though that's not what the FCA does. But I've put governance up here because actually they touch on it throughout their document. And I believe that if there's robust governance around the planning, the monitoring, the oversight, and that you can demonstrate to the FCA that you've got robust governance, it alleviates a lot of the pressure around the level of granularity required in other parts of the planning. Because if you have good governance, you will be in a position to have early tracking systems or early risk indicators. You'll be in a position to be able to activate management to get things done. So that's why I focus on governance up first, and it'll come up again and again. So then the FCA defines the wind down planning process as something which a firm's governing body does. So the firm's governing body identifies the steps and resources it needs to wind down its business. Okay, and the firm's governing body evaluates the risks and the impact of a wind down. and considers how to mitigate them. So that's what the FCA calls the wind down process. So it's identifying the steps and resources to do the wind down and identifying the risks and how to mitigate them. Really simple. And then the FCA goes on to list in paragraph 3.1.3 the component parts that go into contemplating and doing the planning. And it starts with scenarios. So they're looking for scenarios that could lead a firm to no longer be viable. And I will take you through a couple of these when we get to the scenario section. Is then looking for a plan that is underpinned by one of those scenarios. So there's an assumption about a scenario and then a plan that you can enact to harness your business and drive your business through an orderly wind down. And then based on that plan, what resources, financial and non-financial, are needed to deliver that plan in an orderly way. And then this is why I've put governance at the top. They then say you need a process for proactively identifying and mitigating any material risks. So what they're saying is you really need a review process, a governance process around, right, this is our plan, these are resources, but how are we going to monitor it? Which is why I started with governance, and I will just emphasize it comes up again and again. In 3.1.4, the FCA says that the final output and the end product is a wind down plan that is approved. So the key point is it's approved, so typically voted on at a board meeting by the firm's governing body, and it has a nominated person who is tasked with ensuring it is periodically updated for either changes in the business, changes in the market, or changes with counterparts. So a whistle-stop tour through 3.1 being the FCA guidance on what is a wind down plan. So the FCA guidance then takes you to time horizon. And it's interesting because the FCA in paragraph 3.2.3 defines the wind down period as the period between the governing body entering a decision to wind down and the cancellation of permissions. So there's this period on the right-hand side of this picture, and that is what your wind down plan will cover. However, the guidance in paragraph 3.2.4 also speaks about board oversight. So we've put a graphic at the bottom to drill this home, and again, it comes back to my governance point. But board needs to engage, make sure it's got adequate focus on doing wind down planning, and adequate time is given to it. The board needs to engage with setting scenarios, appropriate scenarios, agreeing them. And then once those scenarios have been stress tested by the board, the organization goes away and prepares a plan for one of those scenarios. And then the monitoring is the final piece. And I'm going to take a little detour on monitoring now. What are we thinking about for monitoring? We are thinking that if a scenario has been identified whereby a key risk to your business is the loss of your largest broker, because your broker either changes to another capacity provider or because they go out of business. Well, there will be leading indicators if they're going to go out of business around their financial performance or around the volume of premium they send you. And the monitoring aspect is receiving periodic, up-to-date, accurate reports that monitor the leading indicators that that risk may or may not happen. So that's what the monitoring is. And it's doing that across all the scenarios that the board has chosen to monitor. So that's what we mean by monitoring. Interestingly enough, in here, paragraph 3.3, the firm says, the FCA defines the need to make a decision to trigger a wind down as a firm is not viable if it no longer has adequate financial or non-financial resources to carry on its regulated activities. So a firm is no longer viable if it does not have adequate financial or non-financial resources to carry on its regulated activities. Okay, so that's the trigger as defined by the FCA. That's paragraph 3.3.3. So then if we go into paragraph 3.4, the FCA talks about effective risk management. And this is where many of the things I picked up on the bottom left-hand corner around governance come through. So it's the early indicators of risks. They're expecting you to have those. They're expecting your management information to be timely and to have risk metrics on your appetite. And they are really looking for you to be able to demonstrate that this is taken seriously. So that this is used a little bit like operational resilience, that these tools are used as part of your decision-making process, and that you've identified mitigations you can take that give you enough time to react and mitigate the risk. So that's the paragraph 3.4. And then in paragraph 3.5.5, this is where the FCA reminds senior management that they need to be aware of their directors' duties and what they must not do if the firm becomes insolvent. So it's really important to stress here that the FCA in paragraph 3.5.5 is acknowledging that there is an interplay between senior management's regulatory responsibilities to the FCA and their directors' duties under the Insolvency Act. So, and they make crystal clear that directors should consider both of these. And I just call that out now because we will pick that up again later. Okay, so we have a survey next. If you could please answer the poll, that'd be really helpful. Great. Okay, thanks everyone. Great. So this really is a slightly trick question, and the answer I got from wider market was 67%, but the trick question is actually lenders, and you'll see why I find this such an interesting topic as we move forward when I ask people to consider their stakeholders. Okay. So the next section of the presentation is to go through the FCA guidance on preparing and documenting your orderly wind down plan. So before I go into this in any significant detail, we don't have a one-size-fits-all solution or plan for our clients. We do have general headings that we try to answer, but every single business has its own unique structures, its own unique ecosystem, and its own unique risks. And so I was reluctant to come to this call with a pre-packaged solution because I think everyone's wind down plan needs to reflect their unique situations, and the FCA will be expecting that. So hopefully as we go through the next couple of slides, I can pull out some of the complexity with that. So the guidance in paragraph 3.3 is about scenarios. So some common scenarios that we see with our clients, very healthy clients, very viable clients, have been to consider that one of or their main capacity provider either chooses to change their strategic focus and withdraw from that specific market. In that scenario, they would view themselves as needing to find new capacity from a different capacity provider. However, they would be have a period of notice from their current capacity provider before the TOBA expired, and they would have a former capacity provider still flourishing in the market who would be supportive. So that's one scenario. And in that typical scenario, the risk they're concerned about is they're unable to obtain new capacity from anyone else, so they would have to plan for a wind down, but that wind down plan would include support from an existing capacity provider. Or the other scenario we see is the intermediary concerned that for whatever reason the capacity provider unexpectedly has significant losses, and the capacity provider is unable to maintain the same level of gross written premium going forward. So either halving the gross written premium or in the worst case scenario, not being able to provide any gross written premium the next period, and as such, the intermediary is forced to find new capacity or go into wind down. But in this scenario, to be a wind down where there is only limited support available from the capacity provider. So those are some of the key scenarios, and they're really important because whether you're choosing to plan for a wind down where you've got capacity provider support or a wind down without capacity provider support are fundamentally different assumptions. In one where there's capacity provider support, you may, as the FCA intimates in the letter, plan for the capacity provider to pick up some of the policyholder administrative functions. You can't presume they'll want to, but you may assume that after a period of time they're willing to. And so that might be one of your assumptions. However, in the other scenario, you wouldn't be able to make those plans or make that assumption unless the FSCS was willing to consider it. And so hence the scenario analysis really is so important. And you need to do that to then define what kind of scenario you want to plan for. And it needs to be unique to your business. And so it's not really for anyone to prescribe to you what a scenario is, but it is to encourage you to make realistic scenario analysis. The FCA then calls on people to do an impact assessment. So that's paragraph 3.6. And really what they're saying is, what if you went into wind down, what would the impact be on clients? What would the impact be on counterparts? And what would the impact be on the market? And how would you mitigate that? So again, I'm going to break with the FCA here. I think an impact assessment is really, really good, but we would typically take this a step beyond. We would, in our planning, we prefer to do a stakeholder analysis, which is different. We would be then looking to say, right, if you went into wind down, who are all of the stakeholders who are important to you doing a successful wind down? And what is their position? So we would typically, yes, we would include clients. We would include policyholders. So by the way, I'm just going to clarify some terminology here. When I think of clients, even for MGAs, I'm thinking policyholders. When I think counterparts for MGAs, that's where I include brokers, subdelegates, third-party administrators, and capacity providers. And the market, I typically think of the FCA and competitors. But what we would do under impact assessments, we would actually do a stakeholder analysis. So we'd have the policyholders, the counterparts, the FCA. If you've got any secured lenders, we would have them on the list. If you had shareholders, we'd have them on the list. And then we'd look within your organization at key constituents. So are there some vendors that are really important to you? Is there a landlord that's important to you? Your employees are a constituent part. And we would go through the key stakeholders. And we would want to say, right, how would a wind down affect them? What are your needs from them in a wind down scenario? And then what can you do to mitigate the risk of them doing something unexpected? So retention plans for employees, or contract negotiations with vendors, or if it's your lender, showing them financial analysis indicating that they will be made whole. Or if they won't be made whole, being realistic about the risk of that, and taking the actions you need to do to protect yourself. So that's how we think about the impact assessment. Operational analysis, we are, interesting enough, we are very much aligned with the FCA on operational analysis. However, we tend to approach it slightly differently. The way we've approached this typically is we like to think through, if you're in wind down, what are the functions that each of your stakeholders need to get done during a wind down period? So not the nice to have, the need to have. So for instance, if you're a policyholder, you will want to know that your midterm adjustments can be processed, that if you're getting a non-renewal notice, you get it with plenty of time. If you are submitting a complaint or a claim, there will be infrastructure to handle all of those in as close to ordinary course as possible. So that's a policyholder's expectation. And therefore, as an MGA, what do you need to do during a wind down period to keep as much of that going as possible? And can you, do you have the resources to be able to do that yourself, or do you need to look outside your business to do that? We also then ask, not just from the policyholder, from your counterparts. What do your brokers need from you? What do your TPAs need from you? And what do your capacity providers need from you? So for instance, the processing of bordereau, I mean, that's a key one for both your brokers and your capacity providers and your TPAs, or any conduct issues that the FCA is asking about, where the capacity provider is looking to you to make sure that those are dealt with. So there's just some examples. So it's really going through and saying, right, in an orderly wind down, what needs to get done? And in having defined what needs to get done, it's the next step is looking through your organization across functions. So going across from your claims function to your underwriting function, to your finance function or functions, to your risk functions, audit, saying, right, where in each of these functions do people sit who touch this process? Where in each of these functions does software sit that touch these functions? And it's really identifying by function what resources may be needed and what activities may be needed to keep those activities going. So typically we'd expect some of the risk areas that come up every single time is policyholder data or client data. Other issues are software and systems. Another one is permissions, where perhaps your counterparts will need additional permissions put into their contract so they can contract with each other. And then the next thing from all this is just to overlay the timeline that will be needed to actually do all of these things. And then of course there's states. So that's what we would be doing from an operational analysis perspective, is really analyzing where things get done so you know what to retain. Interestingly enough, and I'm hoping most of you are saying you've done all of this in your operational resilience work, so you can just lift that out of operational resilience. But that's the exercise we would be looking at within operational analysis. The FCA then encourages people to use that analysis to do a resource assessment. And this is where they're saying, look at your non-financial needs. So using that analysis, what are the critical systems, the critical people, the critical infrastructure that you need to be able to do an orderly wind down? And turn that analysis into a financial analysis of what it would cost to do an orderly wind down. And a key part of that obviously is the time it would take to do an orderly wind down. And I'm going to pause here for a little bit because I want to touch on two things with the financial element. There are the business as usual costs, which are things that we've spoken about. But in a wind down plan, there are significant one-off items. Often these are things like severance, in case you decide to slim down your workforce, or contract termination in case you move from a big building to a smaller building, or financial advisors or legal advisors, because directors and officers may want to get advice on their responsibilities. So there are significant one-off costs that really should be factored into the adequate resources financial analysis. And I want to go back to this. The FCA is looking for an orderly wind down plan. It doesn't say a plan to finality. So for instance, if you are an intermediary who has really strong relationships with your capacity providers, you have good relationships with your brokers and your TPAs, and you can arrange for between the three of them for several of your functions to be taken on by your counterparts. We have seen plans where entities realistically could do a wind down in less than 3 months. And therefore the cost to them of a wind down is relatively, is not limited, but it's a very manageable cost. We've seen other entities who sit in these ecosystems with 200 plus counterparts and millions of policyholders their wind down, orderly wind down, is going to be far more complicated and last much longer. So it's a judgment and it's a reflection of the complexity of your business. And the FCA does stop short of being prescriptive. If you go through the FCA's document, the FG21 framework assessing adequate financial resources, which I've poured through several times, they do actually stop short of being prescriptive about what adequate resources are, but they do retain the right to stipulate what resources an individual firm should have. So a little just detour through that, and really the two takeaways at the end of that is a timeline is undefined. Every business is going to have its own timeline depending on its ecosystem, and adequate resources, while there's some guidance, again, this is a judgment and really a discussion with your counterparts and the regulator. The FCA then in paragraph 4.1 covers anticipating reactions. So I suppose what we've done in our approach is do the impact assessment and the anticipating reactions in the same section, and we've just called it stakeholder analysis. So what they're really doing here is they're saying, okay, right, this is your plan. How are your stakeholders going to react? And what is the risk? So let's just say a secured lender might not be supportive, and therefore there's a risk that they might push you towards an insolvency procedure. So it's anticipating that and making sure you have mitigated the risk of that. The FCA then talks about communications plans. And again, this is an area I will spend some more time on the next page, because it's really not as straightforward as some people think it is. They talk about client monies. In every single engagement I've had in the last 18 months, risk transfer provisions have been in every single TOBA I've seen. And so I've become accustomed to taking certain shortcuts with client monies, which is assuming that the capacity provider's on the hook for it. And therefore, the relationship goes straight from policyholder to capacity provider, and we just need to get the bordereau through the system. If risk transfer provisions aren't in place, there's a lot more complexity, and that's almost a whole different session. But where risk transfer is in place, it is probable that significant amounts of the capacity provider's funds will be sitting in trust accounts either at the MGA or the TPA or still at the brokers. And really the challenge in a wind down scenario is just making sure you're demonstrating that your wind down plan maintains that security for the capacity provider, maintains their trust so that they can support you through your orderly wind down plan. It's just a confidence, it's just a necessary step in maintaining confidence, because it's significant cash that belongs to a third party that's sitting in trust accounts that are outside of their control. And then groups. The guidance does talk about where you're planning for the wind down of one part of the group, what the impact may be on other parts of the group. I am conscious that we're onto practical insights. I apologize, I've run 5 minutes slower than I was expecting. Practical insights, so really turning theory into practice. I'm going to go at a canter here as quick as I can, and I apologize because I think this is perhaps the more interesting part of the presentation. I want to start by pointing out that all of my commentary here is assuming a healthy, vibrant, viable intermediary. I want to also reiterate that we think the FCA guidance is really robust. We think it's a really good starting point. And what we've just been doing is pointing out some practical things we do differently when we're doing our planning. However, that we tend to get to the same place the FCA does anyway. So from a governance perspective, my first point, just reiterate that if you've got strong leadership, you've got strong governance, and you can show this to the FCA, then it's more likely that you'll be able to get the FCA support than when you need to get support. So that's what the governance point was. Translating the FCA's objectives. Really what the observation here is, just like any people plans or project plans or change plans, if you take the FCA's objectives and you translate them into practical requirements, such as mitigate policyholder detriment, mitigate impact on capacity providers, mitigate cost, protect our reputation, it can become a almost a mission statement for the project team. And by creating a mission statement, you're setting the rules of engagement for the project team to go away and deliver, and it sets the right tone. So I think it can be helpful early on for the governing board to grapple with the objectives and just turn it into a mission statement, which then gives the authority to the people in the organization who need to work on it, and then for that to be repeated. So that was the second bullet point. Consider all stakeholders. I did touch on this on the earlier page. This is where I really want to take a little bit more granularity on this. So as you consider all your stakeholders, one of them is likely to be a secured lender or a landlord. If your adequate resources assessment indicates that you will be able to wind down, and at the end of your wind down still have sufficient resources to be able to pay your secured lender, to be able to pay any contract termination costs, and to be able to pay any one-off costs associated with the wind down, then you will be winding down in a solvent way. And you should be encouraged to take that analysis to your lenders and to your landlords and to your key counterparts to demonstrate the confidence you have that you can do that. You don't need to do it until a wind down is triggered, but that's what that analysis is there for. But if your analysis shows other, then there is a risk that you may not be able to wind down in a solvent way. And that's a really important distinction, because if you aren't going to be able to complete a solvent wind down, it is likely that at some point you would lose control. In an insolvency process, the insolvency practitioner, I am not one, but their primary responsibility is to creditors. And it is typical in MGA that policyholders are not creditors. And so therefore they don't necessarily have a primary responsibility to policyholders. So therefore an insolvency practitioner's legal responsibilities do not align with the officers and the governing body's regulatory responsibilities. There is an inherent conflict. So if it is possible that you may need to wind down in a non-solvent way, it is worth contemplating the implications of that and seeing what steps you can take to mitigate that. So for instance, if when you're doing your wind down planning, this is a possibility, what do your TOBAs say about the carrier being able to step into your contracts with the brokers or cut through? If they allow for it, well, in the event that you are distressed, well, the carrier has that mechanism. Another example would be where does all of the policyholder data sit? Does a capacity provider have up-to-date copies? If not, is there a work stream to make sure the capacity provider has access on a regular basis to all the up-to-date policyholder data? These are just small things you can do in your ordinary course to de-risk any future wind down planning. And that's really why you just go through it and do the thinking. The next item is, and this one there is no definitive answer again, it's what level of granularity is required. And I really want to stress here, there is no right answer. This is a judgment. And it's really driven by the complexity of your business and your ecosystem. So some of the things that drive complexity is, what is the tail of the business that you've been helping to distribute? Is the business that you're trying to distribute vanilla products where people can go and get replacement cover very easily, or are there credit insurance issues in here? Based on that, what are your cutoff procedures, right? Could you just issue non-renewal notices without causing policyholder harm? Or do you need to be really careful to work with the capacity providers to ensure that there's no harm to policyholders by finding other cover? What is your materiality to your brokers and your TPAs? If the brokers who you engage with are I don't know, if you're 80% of their business, would you going into wind down mean they're not viable? And if that is the case, how long do those brokers need to build new relationships with someone else, therefore to stay viable? And can you give them that time? Or is there now risk of broker failure or TPA failure? These are all questions that are going to be unique to every single business. And only knowing the answers to these questions will therefore define what level of granularity you have to go into. But it is really important to ask the questions and to document the answers to the question and to document your judgment. Because once you've documented your judgment, you will know what the additional steps need to go from where you are on that date to having a plan that you can implement. I mean, the goal here really is to say, we're viable today, we've identified scenarios today, we have great relationships today, we are monitoring the risks, we are monitoring the scenarios, we have the dashboards are coming in green, so that's great, but if the dashboards turn orange, we know what mitigations we're going to take. We're going to try and find new capacity, we're going to work with new brokers, and we need 3 months or 6 months. Yes, we have enough resources for those 3 or 6 months. And we know what we're going to do during those 3 or 6 months to get the plan into such a advanced stage we can issue it. So a great example of this is a communication plan, which the FCA does actually talk about. The communication plans, if you are in a situation where all your dashboards are green and you're feeling good about the business, it is actually enough to say, right, in the event that we were going to go into wind down, we would want to write to all policyholders. Well, we know who those policyholders are. We can get their contact details really easily. Okay, tick, tick. We would want to do a website, and we know what we'd want to say. We'd want to do a press release. We know what we'd want to say. And we know who our counterparts are and what their contact details are, and we know who the sub-delegates are. So it's really just cataloging who you'd need to contact, what the key decision points or messages would need to be, and just having that on file. However, if you're in the orange zone or the red zone and it looks like it might become an issue, well, it becomes more important to demonstrate that actually those letters are written and they are coherent and they're cohesive across the different letters, because different types of policyholders will have different needs, and that you have resources in place to actually get those communications out. And more than that, do you need a call center? And we've actually seen in the orange zone, the FCA asking about those kinds of written documents. However, they wouldn't be asking for those written documents when you're in the green zone, but you need to be able to demonstrate to them that you are effectively monitoring the risks and your governance is robust, so you don't need to have planned to that level. So really just to emphasize that it's a judgment point. And then the final bullet point on this slide is the adequate resources and impact on control, which I jumped ahead and discussed earlier. So that brings me to the end of my prepared comments. I'd love to take questions. Bearing in mind I'm 6 minutes late, I apologize.
Bradley, well, first of all, thanks very much for that. Very informative and insightful. We do have one observation, which I think it makes a very good point around the relationship for MGAs with their insurers. I'll read it. So many MGAs operate under delegated authorities where the controls and rights for any wind down or cessation of business are fully in control of the insurer. The MGA has little or no contractual rights in these circumstances to unilaterally decide on any plan. So the question being against that backdrop, does the FCA guidance encourage MGAs to require an insurer to limit its current options in the binding authority to comply? So you touched on this on slide 12 a little bit earlier. Okay,
so can I repeat the question back to you to make sure I've understood it correctly?
Yeah.
So and I think I'm going to punt as well, so apologies, but I think the question is about an insurance carrier deciding whether it wants to carry on writing that kind of business and how it's going to wind down writing that kind of business. And yes, I would agree, from the TOBAs I've seen, that is the insurance carrier's prerogative as to what risk they want to be on cover for or not. and how they want to wind it down. And I think the question from this audience is what is the FCA saying about the MGAs protecting themselves from the carriers making those decisions? Is that correct, Michael?
Yeah, that would be my understanding of the observation and the question. Yeah, it's whether MGAs should look to with the FCA with guidance encourages MGAs to require an insurer to limit its current options in the binding authority to comply. So effectively, I think this is pushing back that most insurers would actually want to see sight of and be in control of a wind down plan.
I have every single ounce of my experience says while you have a good relationship with your insurance carrier, while you are making good underwriting decisions and it's good quality, it was entirely appropriate to share with them what your wind down plan is and what your expectations of them are in that wind down.
Okay.
Having worked with intermediaries, so head of agency and people like that at carriers, and having worked with intermediaries, I don't see a negative when the relationship is good and you're making assumptions about the support you'll get in wind down and having that conversation.
Yeah, just to take that to the next, because I think it's an important question. You on a good relationship with your insurer capacity, fantastic. If the relationship is, okay, given that the MGA may have little or no contractual rights in terms of the wind down plan, in terms of imposed by the insurer, does the FCA give any guidance to the MGAs in that instance?
Well, sorry, can I push back on that?
Yeah.
These wind down planning guidance that are being provided that we're going through, this is what the FCA is giving to the management teams of the intermediaries to prepare their own wind down plans. I don't think the FCA would look very kindly on you just rubber stamping what the insurance carrier says the wind down plan is, unless the insurance company in the TOBA is similarly agreeing to pay for your wind down. So if the insurance company is going to pay for the wind down and fund it, I understand your hands may be somewhat tied in a negotiation, but the FCA's expectation is that this is the MGA's plan, that the MGA's management have signed off on.
I think that's a very, very valid point, that you cannot rely on your insurer oversight for the wind down plan. You have to have your own plan on top of that. So I agree with that entirely. Absolutely. If I may move on to just another question, which links to sort of TPAs really. So if a cover holder or TPA communicates it is in distress or appears from the outside it is in distress, what are some of the immediate steps that should be taken to protect interests?
Yeah, this one's challenging, right? So this is someone coming to you to say, right, or you realizing that you may have an issue. I think the first thing you do is you do the operational analysis, saying, right, our primary responsibility is to ensure no policyholder detriment. So if this broker failed and fell into the hands of an insolvency practitioner, how can we protect the policyholders? And it gets really nitty-gritty, and it's, do you have the up-to-date bordereau minus a month of all policyholders? So if you need to write to all policyholders because the insolvency practitioner won't, they probably would, but they won't, can you do that? And then do you have the ability to find someone to handle the midterm adjustments and the other policy administration matters that will need to come from those brokers? So to issue renewal notices and things. It's really just considering what your backup plan would be to make sure there was minimal policyholder detriment. And with the TPA, it's similar. And in that scenario, it really would be to probably consider putting your carrier capacity provider on notes that this was a risk and what your mitigation plans were. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it is to the participants. Okay, I think that's it. So again, a really big thank you, Bradley, for your presentation, and to everybody who joined this afternoon. And good luck to everybody in terms of the production of their wind down plans. Thank you very much indeed.
Great. Thanks everyone. Thanks Michael. Thanks Teresa.